All right. Well, this is the highly anticipated, at least for us personally, episode of the year here on the Football Lounge. Got a good downtime in the NFL as we get ready for the draft season. So it's a perfect time to break out our top 10 players of the 21st century list. And Mark, this was a doozy of a list to put together. I know we've talked about it in the week since we've started to curate this list individually about the difficult process it was. We're going to have to leave some guys out, and that's just how it goes when you're breaking down 10 players for a 25-year span.
Yeah, well, and what's cool about this for us is, we're in our early 30s. This is our life as football fans, right? So we don't have to preface anything with like, well, I never saw them play, but the numbers and the stats and the lore. These are guys that we rely on our eye test. And I think so much of my list, when I look at it, I'll defend with just my eye says, I liked that player more. I liked the way that player played the game more than maybe someone who's got better, bigger, more impressive numbers. And so there's so many position groups. There's so many great players since the turn of the last century, and putting them in order of 1 to 10. I feel like I've been so disrespectful to so many guys, but I think it's more, I'm going to look at it as more as I'm giving them the 10 names on my list, the ultimate tip of the cap, the ultimate nod of respect versus not trying to disrespect anyone who didn't make my list.
Yeah, at the end of this episode, we're going to dedicate a little bit of time to discussing our honorable mentions real quick, because there's a ton of them. And I agree, like all of the honorable mentions are very worthy probably of being in the top 10 in some regard on someone's list. But that's what's great about lists is they are subjective.
Yeah.
They're personalized, and that's why we enjoy them so much. We grew up with all of the top 10s on NFL Network, and now we get to, help curate those lists now. And we've given a good amount of time at this point. It's a quarter of a century we've had now of a sample size to work with. Full careers have gone by, multiple careers have gone by at certain position groups. So we have a large grouping of players to choose from, and it's really about how do you fit them in. And the hardest part for me was not just finding out who my top 10 are, but then ranking them accordingly within that top 10.
Yeah.
That was even more difficult. So
it's impossible.
I'm excited.
Let's do it. I'm ready for it.
All right, let's get into a top 10 players of the new millennium. For me, one of the most difficult parts of this process too was wanting to include as many position groups as I could, because I wanted to pay respect to certain positions that maybe don't get as much love on lists such as these, but at the same time, wanting to make sure that I don't just put someone in just because, one of the positions that was really hard for me to figure out was running back, for instance. That was a really difficult one. Were there any highlights for you in terms of position group or era or anything of that sort when you were going through this list?
Obviously, quarterback. You could just do a top 10 quarterback since 2000, and you probably have 10 Hall of Famers. You know what I mean? Like there's so many. So you didn't want to overwhelm with the quarterback group. I'm with you 100%. The offensive line, wanted to make sure I paid respect to at least one offensive lineman in the top 10. And then honestly,
I think I have 3 quarterbacks, and that was like I told myself that's the cap. Like, I want to cap it at 3.
Yeah. And for me, the other thing that's interesting is when fans watch this, our listeners and other people, like, you're going to stand up for your guy. I got into this debate with a friend the other day who's a diehard Saints fan, and I told him, a certain QB that he loves is probably not going to make my top 10, and he was like furious. He's like, how is he not a top 10 of 2009? I was like, well, here's why. I think guys are going to really, you're going to back your guy. And that's where I'll start my list at number 10 if you're ready to jump into it.
Let's do it, yeah.
A guy I'm going to back till the day I die, a 4-time All-Pro, an 8-time Pro Bowler, a Hall of Famer, a member of the 2000s All-Decade Team, Defensive Rookie of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year in 2005, and 9th all-time in solo tackles, Brian Urlacher, the monster of the Midway in this era of football from 2000 on. Brian Urlacher is an all-time great. I was not going to not leave him off this list. He belongs in this list. To me, he's the 3rd best linebacker in NFL history, and I refuse to just be bullied by the fact that some other one person in his position group has to be on this list. I refuse to be bullied to leaving Brian Urlacher off the list because of that. So Brian Urlacher makes it in at number 10. I wasn't gonna try to overdo it.
That's fair.
There are guys
fair.
on this list that I just are better historical players, but Brian Urlacher, since 2000 on, to me, is the top 10 player of all time.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with Brian Urlacher being in the top 10. I will forecast he is not in my top 10, but he definitely made the honorable mentions list for me.
Disgraceful.
He's an absolute great player, and if I were preferentially, I obviously would put him ahead of Ray Lewis, but I also recognize Ray Lewis's impact at the position and overall. It's kind of the Troy Polamalu Ed Reed debate for me too, where I'm like, I personally would pick Troy, but I could absolutely understand people talking about Ed Reed as being, the best at that. So there's, that's where the preferences come into play. And I like it already off with a different, player here in the top 10 list. And I imagine maybe my number 10 player perhaps didn't make your list. And that is a Hall of Famer, a guy who was an MVP in 2006, a 3-time first team All-Pro.
Oh,
he was Offensive Player of the Year, multiple Pro Bowls as well. I'm talking about Mr. Touchdown record-setting running back himself, LaDainian Tomlinson.
LT.
Look, I said it off the top. The running back position was very tough because there's some dynamite running backs, but LaDainian Tomlinson belongs in this top 10 list for me because of what he was able to do game in and game out on the field. I mean, the guy was unstoppable. He was all purpose. So obviously, that probably put him a notch above some other candidates in this grouping. Not to mention, he's a top 5 all time in rushing yards, leader. He had over 1,200 yards for 6 straight seasons in the NFL, which is tough to do at any era. He had over 15 touchdowns on 4 different occasions. He had that 28 rushing touchdown season where he added a few receiving touchdowns as well. An incredible player, honestly, and I'll just kind of forecast, Marshall Faulk is not in my top 10, but he was like Marshall Faulk, only in my view, a little bit better. He kind of had a combination of like Adrian Peterson and Marshall Faulk. He just did it all. And LT, what a dominant player for so long.
You're not going to hear any arguments from me. I will save some comments on LT for a second here, if that's maybe a little bit of a giveaway. Number 9 for me, JJ Watt. I struggle with JJ Watt a bit because JJ Watt's career burned so bright and so strong, but it really was like a 6-year span. Where JJ post injuries, he did have that one bounce back year where he got back into like 12, 13. I think it was like 14 sacks, like 2 or 3 years before he ended up retiring. But overall, in the second half of his career, he was just a solid player, but which is fine. But it's coming off of in a stretch of his 4-year, 5-year peak. Truly, maybe a peak we've never seen before. Catching touchdown passes. 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, Walter Payton Man of the Year, 5-time All-Pro, and, of course, part of the All-2010s team and a 5-time Pro Bowler as well. So those 5 years, Pro Bowl, All-Pro, elite. That's why he's lower on the list for me, but belongs on the list. The accomplishments for a 5-year span in what we're talking about in a fairly short amount of time, 2000 on, was just unmatched on this list, maybe. And it's unfortunate for him that it didn't last longer, because that could really, if it would have had another 2 or 3 more years to this, he'd be 4 or 5 spaces higher on this list on a lot of lists.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you look at just, statistical accomplishments, obviously the 3-time Defensive Player of the Year accolades wise, but when it comes to stats, his 114 and a half career sacks, that's 24th all time.
Yeah.
Not anything that you're going to be like, if you were just looking at sacks and talked about how dominant of a pass rusher he was, if you were trying to explain the story of JJ Watt,
longevity wasn't
like,
there.
What? He's not that, far down the list. But yeah, what he did in a short amount of time, to me, he was one of the locks that had to be in the top 10 just because of that impact alone. So I agree with you there. And we'll get to him in my list as well. Not quite here at number 9, but coming up. So number 9 for me, and some might say he's too low. Some might argue he should be on the list. It's kind of all over the place. Randy Moss, and
Okay.
Obviously he came into the league in 98, had an amazing rookie season, had a great 99 and 2000, and technically the new millennium is considered 2001 and on. We're going to obviously go from 2000 to present day, but he, obviously had record-breaking seasons with the New England Patriots during the late 2000s, early 2010s, and had a career renaissance that we don't typically see, especially from the wide receiver position at that point in his career. And perhaps nobody was more dominant of a deep threat at the position ever. And so the flash, the flare that Randy Moss provided, combined with his incredible hands, he was a Lynn Swann of the new age. And, he paired that with unmatched route running for someone of his size and length at the time. It was kind of the complete package, and obviously was a highlight of those 2000s, no question about it. His career too, like I mentioned, kind of went off for a little bit there with the Raiders. Comes back and shows how dominant he is for several years afterwards.
If you don't think Randy Moss is a top 3 receiver of all time, I don't know what to do with you. You know what I mean? Like, I just don't. He's in that conversation. He's on the Mount Rushmore of wide receivers.
I would say top 5, but I agree. I agree if he's got to be top 5.
Yeah, and so I'm not going to hate on you there. At number 8 for me is LaDainian Tomlinson. I put him slightly higher because he's the only running back on my list. Spoiler. But for me, when it came down to it, LaDainian Tomlinson is the final. Like, as we now know, like, it's not going back. There is no running back drafted today that is going to hit 10,000 yards rushing. I don't think it's going to ever happen again in their career. And LT may be the final stalwart of what truly was the bastion of great running backs. Adrian Peterson is probably the final nail in the coffin for like longevity running backs, where like you surround your offense around a running back. Derrick Henry is a slight, kind of now version of that. But LT was Barry Sanders, Walter Payton. He's everything. I think when we did our running back thing, he was 4th all-time running back on my list, behind only Barry, Walter, and Jim Brown. Like, he's that special.
Same with me too. Yeah.
And people forget, 2nd all-time in touchdowns. So, I mean, he, like, in rushing touchdowns, behind only Emmitt Smith. So he was a force to be reckoned with as far as getting into the end zone. 7th all-time leading rusher, Hall of Famer, 2006 MVP, and a 5-time Pro Bowler, 3-time All-Pro. Love LT, and had to give him some love at number 8.
Absolutely. I love it there. And you're not going to get, he could have been in many different spots on my list as well. Number 8 for me is who I consider to be the greatest of all time at his position. And he has some competition even in this era.
Yep.
But it's Rob Gronkowski for me. And you talk about career trajectory too. He didn't have as long of a career as Tony Gonzalez. He didn't have the receiving prowess of even now Travis Kelce. But Rob Gronkowski was the ultimate complete package, who dominated at the position for many years, and his blocking can't go unnoticed as well. Just, to be in that conversation when he was in the era of the, right after like the Antonio Gates and, like I said, Tony Gonzalez and Travis Kelce, I still think he elevated his game overall above all of those options. And so that's why he is the only tight end on my list. And that's because I consider him the GOAT of tight ends, and that puts Rob Gronkowski in rare company here.
Yeah, the best way to say it is, if you're building a tight end in a lab, like, you want Rob Gronkowski. Like, that's the tight end you want for any era of football going forward in football. Rob Gronkowski will always be, and would have always been, an all-time elite of the elite grade. And that's what makes him so special. And number 7 for me, this is my ode to the offensive line. And this is a player that I don't think gets talked about in the way that, like, Anthony Munoz and, like, the all-time great tackles. I hope he will, as time continues to go on. A member of the 2010s All-Team, 6-time All-Pro, 10-time Pro Bowler, and a first ballot Hall of Famer, Cleveland Browns' own Joe Thomas. Joe Thomas, to me,
wow. All right.
when I looked at all the offensive linemen of this era, Joe Thomas, to me, had the most complete career. He was also an Iron Man, never missed a start, never missed a snap. And that hurt some of his contemporaries, because we see a lot of all-time great tackles in this era that had some real health issues. Joe Thomas, to me, he is in this. There is a couple guys now in a row I'm about to talk about that their careers just kind of mimic each other as well. He got out at the right time. Urlacher, same thing. Urlacher's a part of that. 10 years, boom, I'm done. I gave you my best. I gave you my peak. I wasn't going to hang on for too long. Once the injuries mounted up, I was gone. I was done. He had his first major injury and retired. First ballot Hall of Famer. Joe Thomas plays in any era. He also epitomized a really, really, really horrible stretch of football for a terrible organization and was a stalwart through it all. A high pick that, he lived up to the billing. There's a lot of great offensive linemen. You could swap any of them, a couple of them in this spot for me. I'm going to stick with Joe Thomas because of the health, the way in which he played the game, who he is as a person, like the attitude, everything. He's just a great representative for Cleveland, and an absolute elite of the elite when handling some of the best pass rushers in the AFC at the time, the dudes he had to handle and deal with, and he was phenomenal.
Love it. Yeah, I have a different offensive lineman on this list, but I can't argue with that. I think there are a lot of interchangeable offensive linemen that you could put in. That's a good point about the Iron Man thing. I mean, of all of the offensive linemen that you could put in contention for this, he's the most consistent and the most available. That's for sure, and that's hard to pass by. 7 for me is one of our favorite players of all time. I know for sure one of yours. And, maybe he's too low on the list, but it's Peyton Manning for me at number 7. I remember we had discussed in high school when we would have these types of conversations going to the locker or at lunch.
Yeah.
And we were so adamant that it's Team Peyton over Team Brady all the time. And, that obviously shifted after Brady won 5, then 6, 7 Super Bowls. And we've come around to that. But Peyton Manning, a big place in my heart for, being that early introduction to what amazing, incredible quarterback play is. There are a lot of quarterbacks, as we talked about, that you could, think about for a list of this size. And Peyton Manning was the epitome of accuracy, right? I mean, we had Tom's leadership and Tom's clutch. Peyton, nobody was more precise during that era than Peyton Manning, and he won 2 titles. He went to 3 Super Bowls. Like, the guy won a lot of games as well. And so, I mean, I don't need to, endorse the man any more than I already have. He's, to me, a clear contender on this topic.
I'm on. This is the first time I'm pretty shocked. I'm shocked that he's this low. I'm interested to see. I'm interested to see exactly how you rank some of the other people then, because to me, Peyton Manning is. We'll get to him on my list, but he's considerably higher than not even at the number 6 spot, because at number 6 I go, to me, the only wide receiver on this list, and to me, the second best wide receiver in the history of the National Football League, and to me, a person who is the Barry Sanders of the wide receiver world. To me, a person, if you ask me to build a wide receiver in a lab, if you aliens come down to visit and say, what is a wide receiver in the National Football League that would be literally dominant in any era and going forward, a Hall of Famer, a 6-time Pro Bowler, a member of the All-2010s team, a 3-time All-Pro, Calvin Johnson, Megatron. He's my wide receiver.
Wow.
I have Megatron at 6. And for me, it came down to needing a wide receiver, and that means there is no Randy Moss on my list. And again, that is not a disrespect to Randy Moss. I love Randy Moss. I think he's the 3rd best wide receiver of all time. Jerry, Megatron, Randy. A lot of people might flip that order, might move things around. But Calvin Johnson, I watched him day in and day out in the NFC North do things that no human man should be able to physically do. And he did them with an organization that was just trash and awful and ugly. And him and Matt Stafford for 10 years just did nothing but play backyard football and be absolutely incredible. I think to me, truly, Calvin Johnson is a special talent. He's the epitome again of 10 years, I'm in, I'm out. Joe Thomas, 10 years, I'm in, I'm out. I'm going to give you my best. I'm done. Brian Urlacher, here's my best. I'm not going to another team. The end of my career like Bobby Wagner now did and didn't like that. Brian Urlacher is like, all right, the Bears don't want me. I've given you everything. I'm done. I move on. I think, to me, I appreciate there's something special about that one team, and they went through hell. Urlacher, Joe Thomas, Calvin Johnson, they all played through horrible teams, but were not only just good for their team, they were elite of the elite in the NFL during their peaks and their periods. So I love Calvin Johnson. You may totally disagree, but it's one of those like, I'll just do the la, 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 la. I just don't care because I love watching his highlights. I still think he could play in the NFL today and put up numbies because he was just ungodly.
Calvin Johnson was a absolute specimen, and there are a few that you could compare him to in terms of what he's able to do on the football field. But all that being said, because Calvin Johnson, I think there are definitely arguments, and you made them, about him.
The numbers hurt Calvin because of the length of his career.
Yeah, and the second best all time to me is very, very gratuitous, very rich. I think he's among the best, probably top 10. But I have another receiver coming up on this list.
Okay.
That I don't even think that's a question.
Okay.
So I could argue having him in there over Randy, but I don't see an argument having him over this other guy. But we'll get to that.
Number 6, go for it.
Number 6 for me is the other offensive lineman, Trent Williams. And so I understand the Joe Thomas argument. I'm not going to fault you too much for that. I think Trent Williams' overall dominance and physicality of a man, it's insane what he was able to do in his career. 11 Pro Bowls.
He's a bad man.
3 first-team All-Pro. To me, I think he may be the best offensive tackle of all time.
Yeah, and I don't disagree.
He's top 5 offensive lineman of all time, potentially. And Joe Thomas is probably right in there too. So
Trent's got some longevity. Trent's a meaner player. He plays with a physicality that is different.
Yeah.
To me, it was a coin toss, and I went with Joe because of, I think there's something like what he did with the organization he was a part of and those seasons, and that he strapped it up every game. He never, he could have been like, oh, my hammy's hurting today, guys. I don't want to go out for the 0-16 Browns, even though I'm the only blue chip A+ player on this team.
Yeah. No, that's fair. And I don't know what they have Joe Thomas listed at. Trent Williams on Pro Football Reference is listed at 6'5", 320. I think he's probably about closer to 350.
Yeah, and 6'6". He's a man.
He can run like the wind as well. Just we don't see athletes like that very much.
We don't.
All right, number 5.
Number 5, Aaron Donald comes in at number 5 for me. But there's no rhyme or reason to say he doesn't belong in the top 5. 10-time All-Pro, 10-time Pro Bowler, 8-time All-Pro, Super Bowl champ, 2010's All-Team, 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, Defensive Rookie of the Year. He and one other person on this list are the guys when they redo the next time they do the edition of the top 100 players of all time, like they did a couple years ago for the 100th anniversary season. He wasn't on it, and Mahomes wasn't on it. They're locks for the next time that comes around. And so he belongs in that category. He belongs in that talk. He belongs in the talk as a top 5 just defensive player of all time. That alone belongs in the top 5. So I have Aaron at 5. Maybe a little low, but again, I'm just going off of personal values and things like that. And so Aaron's at 5.
Sure. Yeah, no, fair enough. Aaron Donald is definitely on my list as well.
He's the one who started this list too.
Year, so.
When he retired, it made you start thinking like, well, how do you rank him against J.J. Watt? How do you rank him against a Calvin Johnson? It's like these guys that we've seen grow up in our lives, in our career. And so shout out to Aaron Donald for that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Number 5 for me is what's already been mentioned, J.J. Watt. comes in at 5 for me. And the reason I have him this high is I view J.J. Watt a lot like I view Gale Sayers.
Yeah.
And, Gale Sayers on our list of the top 10 running backs of all time, for me, came in at 6 all time. And that's pretty. There's been a lot of running backs in the NFL, and there's been a lot of defensive ends in the NFL. And J.J. Watt, to me, is a top 5 all-time defensive end, probably top 10 all-time defensive player, period. And so while his career was short and while he did battle injuries, what we saw, much like Gale, was a flash of greatness that hadn't been repeated. Or if it has, less than a handful of times in NFL history. And so for that, 3-time defensive player of the year, there aren't many of those. J.J. Watt in rare company there. And that's why for me, he had to be top 5 because I placed an importance on that, much like
the peak
I did
of the peak
with Gale Sayers.
The peak of the peak. And it's why I had to get him on my list. I just look at that, like the 10-year stretch of a Donald, and I have him below Aaron Donald. And I guess we'll just keep going and it'll kind of play it all out. For me, number 4 is Ray Lewis. And Ray Lewis, I couldn't get him into the top 3, but Ray Lewis's numbers are just ungodly. 12-time Pro Bowler, 7-time All-Pro, 2 Super Bowls, Super Bowl, 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, all 2000s team, and he's a part of the NFL Top 100 team. That being a part of the NFL Top 100 team really does matter, because that's showing you that they belong. In the NFL's world, they absolutely belong in the pantheon of the all-time greats, right? And so then how could they not be among the all-time greats in this 22, 23-year stretch that we're talking about? Ray Lewis at 4.
Ray Lewis at 4. At 4 for me is the only one I'm probably going to have an issue with you, with the Calvin Johnson thing. And that's, for me, Larry Fitzgerald is the second best receiver of all time. If we want to talk about Iron Men at the position, Larry Fitzgerald certainly fits the bill there. 261 games.
I love Larry Fitzgerald.
Started.
I love him so
had more tackles in his career than drops.
Yeah, he's very good. He's very good.
He's really, really good. He's second all time in receiving yards.
He's very good.
He also, kind of like the Joe Thomas argument, played for a team that was really bad for the majority of his career.
Very bad.
And was the
A
leader
lot of quarterbacks.
There. Walter Payton Man of the Year award winner, 11-time Pro Bowler, only a first team All-Pro once. So that's a knock on him. But overall career and what he was able to do in terms of amassing the leaderboard statistics that he did, being on largely a bad team for many, many years. I just can't overlook it. He's incredible. To me, he's second best of all time. It's Jerry Rice, Larry Fitzgerald.
This is where it's hard. So, like, Larry would be top 4 for me, like after Randy, Jerry, Calvin, Randy, Larry. The struggle I've always had with Larry, and now that I think his career is done, and it ended in such a weird, vague way, right? There was never retirement, didn't come back, and we expected him to. For me, my problem with Larry, now that I look at it compared to Calvin, I watch
He never seems dominant.
Yeah.
Maybe that was...
Larry had the stretch in the playoffs where he got them to that NFC Championship game, right? And he got them to that Super Bowl. Like, he was dominant. But there just is something about Calvin Johnson where you watch it, you're like, I don't understand how that works. That doesn't make any sense. Larry Fitzgerald is, to me, is like Jerry Rice 2.0. Kind of in like Magic is LeBron. LeBron is Magic. They have this route running, this ease to their game. It translates any genre. I hate that I don't have Larry Fitzgerald. I hate that I don't have Randy Moss on this list. They were two of the hardest people to leave off. I went with one wide receiver, and I stuck with the guy that I just love watching the most. And I think it's a talent-wise, is just the talent's off the charts. So it is a big disagreement, and that's why we do these lists. You and I, we see things differently. Number 3 for me, Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes belongs on this list. He belongs this high on this list. Already a 2-time All-Pro, a 2-time MVP, a 3-time Super Bowl MVP, which is probably the most impressive thing in his young career. a offensive player of the year in 2018, 3 Super Bowls, and a 6-time Pro Bowler. Patrick Mahomes, when it's all said and done, is the only guy right now who you can project out to be in the debate for the greatest football player of all time with Tom Brady. It's Toms and Toms alone for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years. But in 7, 8 years from now, if Pat's still doing things like he's doing now, then that is a real conversation. And it's incredible what he's done this early in his career. And I may be seeming disrespectful to a Ray Lewis, to all these greats that J.J. Watt and Aaron Donald have Pat ahead of them. But I think they'd even understand quarterback is the most important position. It is valued exponentially. He is elite of the elite, and he did it he's doing it at such a high level so early in his career. Pat's at 3.
Yeah, Pat's at 3 for me too, for all the same reasons you said. So I don't need to rehash all of that. I absolutely agree. Number 2 for me is Aaron Donald, and that's because I consider him potentially the greatest defensive player to ever live.
Yeah.
It's like Lawrence Taylor, Aaron Donald for me are like the 2, and then Reggie White. It's like those 3 players packaged in. So because it's that significant of a footprint on 100+ years of the NFL, that's what elevated Aaron Donald to me.
Does that mean you don't have Ray Lewis on your list?
It does mean I don't have Ray Lewis.
Wow. I don't feel bad at all about my omissions then. Okay. All right.
Well, the reason I don't have Ray Lewis on the list, and it's, he's number 1 honorable mention for me. He's number 11, basically. The reason I didn't have him on the list, and it's probably an unfair reason, was that I did feel that like Brian Urlacher and even Luke Kuechly were all in that realm for me. And so I was like, shoot, it was hard for me to fully commit to elevating one above the other.
Wow.
And so I ended up just leaving all middle linebackers off the list, which was really hard.
Listeners, credit to me. I hate Ray Lewis. I despise every player I've talked about on this list.
I'm a Steelers fan.
Every player I talked about on this list, I love, except for Ray Lewis. And I can at least put that aside to be like, the dude is, to me, he's incredible. He is him, Aaron Donald, Lawrence Taylor, Reggie White. They're the guys that are in the discussion for the greatest, Dick Butkus, the 5 greatest defensive players of all time. So we disagree there. Number 2 for me,
a huge blunder.
My number 2 for me is Peyton Manning. To me, Peyton Manning still at this time is in the 2 spot. That feels like it will be Pat's eventually. 14 Pro Bowls, 7 times he was All Pro, 5-time MVP, 2-time Super Bowl champion, 2-time a Super Bowl MVP, All 2000s team, NFL Top 100. Peyton Manning to me is still, if you were to say to an alien race, what does a quarterback need? 90% of it, you would talk about Peyton Manning. And then there'd be about 10% that you'd talk about Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes mixed in, where you'd say, I want him to be a little bit more arm talent and reckless, kind of like Pat. And then a bit of that, you'd say, I want him to be a natural born asshole of a leader like Tom Brady. And that's what Peyton was missing. Peyton has everything except for that God-given extra bit of arm talent that Mahomes has. And then he doesn't have that. I am a murderer. I'm a psychopath. I'm going to kill you. Peyton Manning's an analytical psychopath, but not like a American Horror Story, Christian Bale psychopath like Tom Brady, who is number 1.
There you go. Yeah, number 1 for me too. I was gonna say it's either Kyle Juszczyk or Tom Brady in the number 1 spot. So we had to give some love to the fullback, but. Yeah, no disagreement there. I know we're kind of running up on time. I don't know if you have time to go through honorable mentions. Or if we want to me,
I'll read a couple off. Like I hated leading. I didn't have any tight ends, and part of that is Gonzalez, Gronk, Antonio Gates, and Travis Kelce. To me, are 4 of the 5 greatest tight ends of all time, and they're all you could put any of them in there. I'd be happy. I'm not going to argue too hard. Ed Reed, Devin Hester. Julius Peppers, other name we didn't mention.
Yeah, good call.
The 3 quarterbacks I considered but didn't make it, Big Ben, Breeze, and Aaron Rodgers. But they were the only other 3 I really considered for this list. The other offensive linemen, Trent Williams, Zach Martin, Jason Kelce.
Yep.
Troy Polamalu, Tyreek Hill, Adrian Peterson, I wouldn't have fought you too hard if any of those names showed up. Was there any others that I didn't say that you?
Yeah, some others I had. Von Miller was one I had on there.
Vaughn,
that was pretty high up, only because we didn't really have an edge rusher, and I was like, that did become kind of a new position.
Yeah,
In the late
Just an
2000s,
edge.
and now it's been incredible. And so Von Miller was kind of the him and DeMarcus Ware, but Von Miller
He's the
had a much
prototype.
more, longevity there. Darrelle Revis, for how dominant he was for a large stretch of time.
Yeah.
Put Champ Bailey in there too. Richard Sherman, like those guys are, Brett Favre was in the consideration for me.
The hard thing about him is he really truly is half 90s, he was done playing by 2011.
Yeah.
So like his 20 years is like
his heyday was the 90s and really early 2000s. I agree with you there. So those are the others. Adrian Peterson definitely I agree with was there in terms of the running backs. Were the other considerations there. But yeah, I mean, Ray Lewis was the biggest snub by far, and I'll probably catch a lot of heat for that. But
don't worry, I'm gonna catch heat. I'm definitely gonna catch heat for Randy Moss and probably no tight end. I will, and we'll see what people think about Peyton Manning 2 versus 7. That'll be an interesting one to see what the crowd thinks.
Big difference.
We'll post this, and we should also post like an actual write out. I have yours written down too. I'll put up something and actually then later in the week put on social media like, all right, here's it written out. Where do we get right? What do we get wrong? And we want to hear from our listeners what their top 10s look like. Because I could look at people's top 10s like this is fascinating.
I know. Yeah, exactly. No, we've made our case. Now please make yours, and we're happy to hear you out. So that's been a fun edition here on the Football Lounge with Mark and Dan. We are back at you next week with our first round mock draft. Before we get into the following week, which of course is draft week. A reminder, we will be live during the first round of the draft. And I'm going to tease a little something too. We're going to have a special appearance. At least it's in the works right now. Mark doesn't even know about this.
I don't.
Hoping to get that for you on
it's
draft
Ray
day
Lewis.
as well.
He's going to murder you on camera.
He's coming on to plead his case for our top 10 list. All right. Appreciate you all being here, and we will see you next time.